Hey there, drone fans. Rick here again from Drone Valley. Welcome back to our new Flyer series, and today we're going to discuss the importance of knowing your location. Because I promise you, once you get good at flying a quad in your own backyard, you're going to immediately think of all the amazing places you visited and how awesome they're going to look from 200 feet in the air. Or maybe you're like me, where I carry the quad with me in the car, and we can't seem to even get through a short trip anymore without Dad stopping that car at least a half a dozen times because there's a new waterfall or a lake that just has to be explored from above. I'm telling you, it becomes an obsession, which makes it really important to understand if you're even allowed to fly at that particular location. So my recommendation is, before you pull a quad out of your bag or ever power it up, you do a little bit of research and make sure that where you're standing is a place that you're permitted to fly, because a lot of new flyers are surprised by the fact that there are restrictions, both at the federal level, the state level, and even the local level sometimes, that would prohibit you from putting a quad up in the air. So I'm going to give you a couple of techniques for figuring out, can you fly there, can't you fly there? And if you find yourself in a situation where there's a local park that you want to fly and you feel that it's unfair that they've restricted the flights there, I'll give you some links below where there are organizations that'll work with you to talk to that local municipality or even talk to the state level to see if you can get some of those restrictions relaxed a little bit. And that's super important because I know it sounds political, but my view is if the FAA is really the governing body of what can fly in the airspace, I don't really think it's fair that a state or a municipality can step in and say, look, we think that the FAA is a little bit lax on this and we don't want you flying in this park. It just makes it very confusing for us flyers. So I wish there was one map that everybody agreed to, but unfortunately there isn't. So you have to do your homework because ultimately you're the pilot in control. And if you put a quad up in a restricted airspace, there's no excuse. There's no, I didn't know. Ignorance is no excuse for the law in this case. You're responsible and you're going to end up probably in some trouble if you do that. So let's not worry about that. Let's just fly and have fun, but do your homework and it just makes flying a whole lot easier. So in the clip, I'll go into some of those techniques. Then at the end, I'll come back and maybe give you a preview of what's coming next. So stay tuned. Let's get into it. In this section, I'll explain why it's so important for a flyer to know their location. And my strong recommendation is before you ever power up your quad to fly in a particular area, actually before you leave your house to travel to that location, you take some time and do the research to make sure you can actually fly your quad at that beautiful lake or beach, because there are restrictions out there that limit where you can fly these, and it's important you understand where those restricted areas are so you don't get in a whole lot of trouble. Now the good news is, probably 99% of the country, you can fly your quad, not have issues. And honestly, if you want to travel to a location and fly and find out you can't, you can probably drive a mile this way or drive a mile that way and put your quad up and have a beautiful afternoon. But it is important to understand that, and there's nothing more frustrating than not doing the research, getting in your car, driving to a location and finding out, I can't fly here, because that's just going to ruin the day for you. So do the research and you'll be in good shape. Now, what gets confusing is it would be great if there was one database that had all the restrictions, but there isn't. There's a lot of overlapping restrictions out there that you have to kind of research. So it starts at the federal level. So the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, publishes a list of what they call NFZs, or no-fly zones. And those are areas where you can't fly. Those are things like airports and nuclear power plants, power grids, prisons, things like that you wouldn't really want to fly near anyway. So those are kind of easy to figure out. But then below that, you may have a state restriction. Some states are restricting where you can fly. For example, in New York, big cities, you can't fly over New York City. Other states have restrictions on big cities. So you have to know what the state restrictions are. Below that, there may be county restrictions. Like in New Jersey, we have counties, which is kind of a local ban. And some counties have restrictions on where you can fly. And then even below that, a park or a beach or a forest may have restrictions where local municipalities have decided these things are a hazard, we don't want you flying there. Now, it's frustrating for me because I feel like if the federal authority, the FAA, has said you can fly anywhere you want except these areas, it's kind of interesting. The states can come in and the municipalities can come in and the local parks can come in and say, even though the Federal Aviation Administration feels it's safe, we don't think it's safe and we're going to put bans in place. So the good news is a lot of that's turning a corner. So a lot of that's being rescinded at this point. So for example, in New Jersey, we used to have a lot of restrictions on state parks and beaches and even areas where I'd want to fly where nobody was around. I couldn't fly because local municipalities have decided these things are a hazard and we don't want them up in the air. Well, a couple of years ago, a bunch of flyers get together and presented to the government, the state government, and said, this is kind of ridiculous. Like if the Federal Aviation Administration is fine with us flying here, why is New Jersey so afraid of this? And why are municipalities allowed to overrule sort of what the federal rules are? And the governor looked at it, took it under advisement, and said, you guys are right. I'm going to rescind all those local bans. So 2 years ago, he signed a bill that basically eliminated all those local bans. So it gave me just a tremendous amount of areas that I can fly in now that I couldn't fly in before. So that's a really good thing. And if you live in an area where you've got those kind of bans, there are organizations that'll help you actually work towards getting those things turned around. And I'll put some links below where you can work on that. But typically it starts at the state level, which would be the best way to do it, because the state would say, this is now the law of the land for all of the counties that are in our area, or all the parks and such, like New Jersey did. And New Jersey is smart because they actually reflected the FAA regulations. So anything that's on the FAA NFZ list is certainly in place in New Jersey, but anything that isn't doesn't count. So it's a really nice thing to do. But the nice part is that if you start flying some sophisticated drones like the Mavics, a lot of the DJI products, they actually have those NFZs built in. So they've got sort of geofencing built into it. It lets you know that you're approaching sort of a warning area for an airport or a prison or a nuclear power plant. So they kind of keep you honest and protect you from inadvertently flying into those locations. A lot of the simpler drones don't have that kind of geofencing built into it. And a lot of people like that because they're like, I can fly where I want, but you could get into trouble if you don't have that geofencing. I like that I can look at my screen and see that I'm approaching an area that I shouldn't be flying in, so I just turn around and fly back. It's a nice little help if you're out there in the field to let you know you're heading into a scary area. All right, so having said that, there are a lot of tools to help you as well. So you can get on the internet and you can do research. You can go to the state site, the county site, the park site you want to fly at, do the research. And if you find out that a particular lake, let's just call it Groom Lake, I made that up, but Groom Lake, you want to fly there, you've done the research, there's no bans from a federal level, state level, or the local park level at that lake that you can fly, I'd recommend you print that out. So if there's rules about that lake, about no swimming, no fishing, no whatever, if there's no drone rule, print that out and bring it with you. Because if you get there, a lot of times there'll be local officials that maybe aren't as familiar with the rules and feel like they can, for the day, decide, I don't want the drone flying there. They don't really have the authority to do that. And I'm not saying get into a wrestling match with a park ranger. What I'm saying is if you have the paperwork, and you have a polite conversation, having that documentation can shortcut that conversation and eliminate a lot of the hassle. So you don't want to just be a my word against your word kind of thing, because they're going to win that discussion. But if you have paperwork with you, that'd be a good thing to have. Like, for example, in New Jersey, I carry that state mandate now that shows I can fly in a particular park, because I've had park officials approach me based on the old rules saying, we have a ban in this park for that quad. And I say, well, it's been rescinded 2 years ago. Here's the legislation that enacted that. So it makes it a lot simpler a conversation. There's also a ton of applications you can get for your phone. One of them I'd recommend is Before You Fly, and I'll put a link below to it. It sort of is a geo-locator that when you're in a particular area, it'll tell you where the airports are around you, where the restricted zones are around you. So it's a really good tool to use as another method of making sure that you're flying in an area that doesn't have any kind of restrictions in place. And there's a bunch of apps out there that do a great job of that as well. It's wonderful what the internet's done for us, because it's really been a big aid in helping us understand where to fly. All right, the last thing I'll talk about, which isn't really a restriction, but it's something you should be aware of, it's around privacy and private property. Now, there is no restriction nationally where you can't fly over private property. You certainly can, but it's a common sense thing with me that the one thing the public fears most about these drones is obviously falling out of the sky and hurting somebody. So the federal rules say that you can't fly directly over people. They don't really say you can't fly over private property, but my recommendation is if you're going to fly over somebody's property, keep the drone high, keep it at 200 feet, don't hover at 30 feet, don't fly over his property at 20 feet, don't hover. That's the worst thing, because a drone hovering over a piece of property, even to me, screams surveillance, invasion of privacy. Like, that gets me mad. So the common sense I'd use is if it's something that's going to bother me, it's probably going to bother them. So the rule I use is if I'm flying over private property, keep it over 200 feet and keep it moving. Don't stop. There's no reason for me to stop over somebody's yard. I don't really care that they've got a nice pool or a nice garden. It's none of my business down there. I'm trying to get to that lake that I want to fly, where I'm allowed to fly and take some beautiful pictures. So use some common sense there. That gets tricky state to state, because some states have passed sort of aerial privacy laws where if you're in the vicinity of a backyard, you could be violating the privacy by flying the drone. So it's really important to understand what your state says about that. But in general, with private property, you're not going to have any hassles with most people as long as you keep moving and you're high enough up where you can't really get a view of their backyard. So just something to keep in mind. And that's pretty much all I had on this section. So be smart about it. Research the area you're going to fly before you get up, because you're the pilot in charge. And ultimately, it's on you. There's no such thing as, I didn't know there was a ban in place. It doesn't matter. It's your responsibility the minute you power this thing up and put it up in the air to know that you can or you can't fly in a particular area. And no one's going to care that you didn't know that. You're going to be guilty as charged. So make sure you do your homework and don't make it a hassle. It's not that big a deal. Again, 99% of the country, I can fly every day and have a great afternoon. Just avoid the areas you can't fly. Get out there, have some fun, and you'll have less stress when you're flying. Well, that's it for this clip, and I hope you found that information helpful. The one thing I'd like you to take away from this conversation is that you really need to know your location as a pilot, and doing your research ahead of time just makes things easier for you. So if you know you're going to fly on a Saturday morning, you've already checked the weather, it's going to be beautiful and sunny, your batteries are charged, you're going to want to bolt out the door first thing on Saturday morning. Take some time that Friday before you want to fly and do the research on the locations you're going to head to make sure you can put your quad up, and then print that information out, because every now and then you may show up at a location and start flying and somebody there may think you shouldn't be flying. It could be a bystander, might be a park ranger, but having that information with you in printed form just makes that conversation go a lot easier. And always be polite, and you're not always going to win that discussion, but obviously there's a difference of opinion, and you having that documentation sort of helps that conversation along. But my rule of thumb is, if I'm talking to somebody for more than 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to give up. And I'm going to give up because I'm thinking in my head, I could be flying someplace else for those 5 or 10 minutes. If it's a place that I really want to fly and it's a park ranger that's misinformed, I'll come back on a rainy day when I can't fly and talk to their supervisor about the rules and find some understanding between us about how we can fly in that location. The other thing I will mention is that when you move from simpler quads to more sophisticated quads like this DJI product, a lot of those NFZs are built into the quad. And that's another layer of protection. And I know some people hate that. They're like, I don't want restrictions on my quad. But those NFZs that are built in here prevent me from flying in areas that I shouldn't be flying. So I view that as a good thing. But always have an application ready. So if you're going to fly spontaneously and you pull over the side of the road and want to fly near a waterfall, spin up an app like that Before You Fly app, or any application you find that you're comfortable with that'll tell you immediately if you're standing in an area where you can actually put up a quad. It'll also tell you that where you're flying is fine, but if you go too far this direction, you're going to hit an NFZ. That's really good stuff, and it's immediate. It gives you exactly what you need to fly. So that's pretty much it. I love flying. I know you guys love flying. This is just making things simpler for you. Don't stress about the NFZs. Don't stress about the places you can't fly. Just find a place that you can fly. Charge up your quad, put it up in the air, and just enjoy the day. It's a beautiful hobby, and you're going to love it. So that's it. If you have any questions about anything I've covered, drop them in the comments below. I've got a ton more content coming. I'm trying to break these into shorter segments to make them a little bit more consumable, sort of in bite-sized pieces. But I love getting back to you with questions you've got, so drop those below. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button, because again, this series is going to have a lot of really good content in it, and you wouldn't want to miss any of that stuff. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. And that's the end of it. So thanks an awful lot for watching. And until next time, happy flying.